Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the third in the PESI special series of talks by Dr. David Burns on the 4 great deaths of the self. I'm Dr. Rhonda Borowski, the host of the Feeling Good podcast and a team therapist in California. Dr. Burns is the creator of the new powerful team therapy, the author of the best-selling self-help books, Feeling Good and Feeling Great, and an adjunct emeritus professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University's School of Medicine. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Rhonda. Today we're going to talk about the third of the 4 great deaths of the self, and this is the angry, blaming self, and this is the self that gets into conflict with others. And we're going to focus on one of the most common forms of conflict is when you feel like you're being unfairly criticized, and typically you respond with argument or defensiveness, and the thing escalates. One of the tools I've developed is called the 5 secrets of effective communication. There's 3 listening skills, a self-expression skill, and there are actually EAR, empathy, assertiveness, and respect. The empathy skills are the disarming technique, thought and feeling empathy, and inquiry. The self-expression skill, the assertiveness skill, is I feel statements, and then the respect is stroking, which is expressing warmth and respect even in the heat of battle. And by far the most important of these is the disarming technique. And that's a technique that I created that's really helpful when you're being criticized, but it's paradoxical and it's totally kind of unfamiliar. Instead of arguing with a criticism, you find the truth in the criticism. You genuinely agree with the person who's criticizing you. And if you do it skillfully, the law of opposites will apply. The law of opposites says that if you're criticized, if you're given a ridiculous, unfair criticism and you defend yourself, your defense will prove that the critic is right. In contrast, and that's a paradox, if you defend yourself against a false, untrue criticism, the very fact that you're defending yourself will actually prove that it's a valid criticism. And the critic will become even more critical of you and even more determined that the criticism is valid. In contrast, if you genuinely and immediately agree with a criticism that's totally ridiculous, totally unfair, totally exaggerated, the moment you genuinely agree with it, it won't be true anymore, and the critic will stop believing it, and your relationship with that person will be transformed. And again, that's a paradox. That's when you agree with a false criticism, you'll prove it wrong, and the critic will no longer believe that criticism. Well, let me give you a personal example. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and this is something which, if you like, it takes a lot of practice to learn it, but this can be a life transforming thing to learn about, the disarming technique. Early in my career, I was, of course, a pretty unknown person, and I had started my private practice, and I was writing the book Feeling Good because I was so excited about these tremendous new cognitive therapy techniques I was learning and helping to create and develop. And after Feeling Good was published, I got a call from a man, let's say in South Carolina, and he said that he'd read the book Feeling Good, and he said that he had had a serious problems with depression, and he'd been all around the United States getting treatment for the top people, the top person at the National Institute of Mental Health, the top expert at the University of Chicago, the department chairman at UCLA. And he said nobody had been able to help him. But when he read Feeling Good, he realized that I was the one that was going to help him. And he said he was very wealthy and that he wanted to fly to Philadelphia once a week for a double session and then fly back home after the session. And I was pretty insecure, but a little narcissistic. And I thought, oh boy, this is so exciting. My book is out now and I'm going to get famous and all these important people are going to come to me for treatment. I kind of got sucked into that, thinking I was special, I guess. And I was very excited and looking forward to meeting him. And so the day that finally came, and he was waiting in the reception room, and I'd finished with my previous patient, went out to shake his hand, and when he looked at me, his jaw dropped, and he looked shocked. And he came in and sat down, and I said, "Well, Ralph, you look upset. Is something wrong?" And he said, "Well, when I read your book, Feeling Good, I had the impression you were an old man with gray hair." I think he was thinking of Aaron Beck, who had gray hair and was much older than I was. I was learning it from Aaron Beck. Aaron Beck was, I guess, somewhat my mentor at the time. And so he said, You're too young to be my doctor." And boy, within 1 minute of meeting that man, he had punctured my bubble and deflated me, and I felt like about 1 inch tall. But I also felt like it was an unfair criticism, and I made the mistake of defending myself, which is what I'm sure you do when you're criticized. It's what most of us do. In fact, nearly everybody does that nearly all the time when you're feeling hurt and upset and you feel like you've been unfairly criticized. And so I told him, well, I may be young, but I've had a tremendous amount of experience in the treatment of depression. I know you have bipolar illness. I used to run the lithium clinic at the VA hospital, and I also know all of the new cognitive therapy techniques, which can be so tremendously helpful even in the treatment of manic depressive disorder. And then he said, um, he started getting more agitated because I had defended myself, and he says, "Well, Dr. Burns, uh, the head of psychiatry at UCLA, he couldn't help me, but at least he had a good bedside manner, and the chief of the National Institute of Mental Health had a good bedside manner." He couldn't help me, but he was warm and empathic. And the fellow in Chicago, he had a good bedside manner, even though he couldn't help me. But he said, "But you don't even have a good bedside manner." And I thought, oh man, this is going from bad to worse. But I still felt like I was being unfairly criticized. And so I tried again to defend myself, which is the huge mistake that almost all of us make almost all of the time. And I said, well, you know, uh, if you if you needed surgery, would you want to go to an inept surgeon with a great bedside manner, or a tremendous surgeon even though he didn't have a good bedside manner? I said, I think you'd want to go to the surgeon that had the tools to help you, not someone just because they have a good bedside manner. And I have tremendous tools to help you overcome your depression and the mood problems that have been plaguing you. And at that point, he got really angry because, again, I was arguing with him, telling him that the points he was making weren't valid. I was trying to defend myself, defend my ego. And he got up out of his chair and he walked over to the door to the office. And he said, Dr. Burns, I paid your receptionist for a 2-hour session. And I've only been in here for 5 minutes. And you can keep that money. I don't care. But I'm going to walk out of this door right now, and you're never going to see me again. And at that point, I kind of sensed that I'd been screwing up. And I remembered I even had a chapter in Feeling Good called How to Talk Back Under the Fire of Criticism. And I emphasized the disarming technique to find truth in the critic, what they're saying, to acknowledge their feelings, to convey warmth and respect. And I'd completely forgotten all of the 5 Secrets of Effective Communication, especially the disarming technique. And so I said, Fred, or whatever his name was, I don't even remember now what his name was, but I said, just before you walk out that door, could you just do me a favor and just take it from the top one more time? And he says, well, doctor, I've been trying to tell you that you're too young to be my doctor. And I said, Fred, here's what I want you to know. I want you to know that your criticism is absolutely valid. And I can imagine how disappointing it would be to expect a wise, seasoned senior clinician and then to be treated by a fellow just barely out of his residency, just starting his private practice. I can imagine how disappointed and frustrated and maybe even angry you were feeling. And then when I started defending myself from your criticisms, that was certainly an amateurish thing to do, the error that a beginner would make. And I feel kind of ashamed of myself for having made those errors because I really like you and I was excited to have the chance to work with you. But when you walk out that door, I want you to just keep one thing in mind. And he said, what's that, doctor? I said, just remember that you were right and I was wrong. And when I said that, his jaw just dropped again, and he went back and slumped down in the chair, and he looked at me, and he shook his finger at me, and he says, Dr. Burns, no shrink ever talked to me like that before. You're my man. You're the one I want to work with. And we had just a tremendous session, and he continued to work with me, and we had did some great work together. But that was, you see, that's the most painful of the 4 deaths of the self, to me anyway, to have to look at your own role in a conflict and see that when people are criticizing you, it's actually valid what they're saying. And if you defend yourself, the problem is going to escalate and they'll become even more convinced. And I had proven to him that he was right. When I defended myself rather than responding with empathy and understanding, that was proof. Yeah, this guy is too young. And then when I finally stopped doing that and agreed with him and saw the truth in what he had to say, suddenly it wasn't true anymore. And we both kind of died and went to heaven. We were reincarnated, and it was just a great thing. And so that's the third of the 4 great deaths of the self. So thank you so much. I can tell you that's happened to me many times since as well, and that disarming technique has actually transformed my life. Not only has it been tremendous helpful in my work with individuals, patients with troubled relationships, to teach them these same fabulous tools, so it's been a huge breakthrough personally and professionally for me. That's called the disarming technique. And now back to you, Rhonda.
Well, thank you again, David, for that. All of your stories are so inspiring. But how do you let go of the angry, blaming self, or how do you disarm someone when they really are wrong? When you're in a relationship with someone that might be belittling you or putting you down or calling you names, I mean, how do I find the truth when somebody's calling me a jerk or when someone is yelling at me?
Well, there's really 2 issues involved here. The first is, do I want a better relationship with this person? Because when you're in conflict with someone, you have a choice. You can leave the relationship, and sometimes it's good to get out of a relationship if you're working with if say you're connecting with someone who's an amphetamine addict and they're dealing drugs and they're paranoid and they're violent. So sometimes it might be better to leave that relationship. And if you make that choice, it's even more important to learn the 5 secrets of effective communication so you don't get killed on your way out the door.
Mm.
Or you may choose to stay in the relationship and not change. or you may choose to stay in the relationship and work to make the relationship better. And that's a decision you have to make personally, and the therapist also can play a role in that decision. But then if you do decide to stay, I've never seen a criticism that didn't have truth in it. And the odd thing is, when you acknowledge that truth, suddenly it won't seem true anymore. An example of was one of my residents when I was in Philadelphia was on call at the VA hospital, and there were some medical students with him, traipsing him around, following, trying to learn. And he was called on an emergency to the psychiatric unit, the locked unit, and they said that one of the patients there was psychotic and exploding violently, and to come up and try to do something. Everyone was terrified, and so they went up the elevator, and the medical students were all excited. This is going to be this dramatic thing that they're going to witness. And when the resident went with the students, this patient was 6'7", 285-pound guy, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs in the day treatment room next to this glass bookcase, and shouting that his psychiatrist had betrayed him, and he was filled with rage, and the medical students were so eager to do something. He said, "Oh, we know your psychiatrist. She's a fine person." And he said, "No, she promised to see me today, but she's out of town, and she didn't even tell me she was going out of town," this type of thing. And they were saying, "Well, she's just at a conference. She'll be back tomorrow." And then he picked up a chair and smashed the glass bookcase and the chair. And now he was standing there screaming with these two kind of wooden clubs in his hands. And then the resident, who had been practicing the 5 secrets in my weekly training group, said, "Hold on, let me show you a little different way." And he said to this man, did you say your psychiatrist promised to see you and then went out of town without telling you?" And he said, "Yes, yes." And the resident said, "Well, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound fair at all. I'd also feel hurt and angry if I'd felt betrayed like that." He said, "I think you've got every reason to be angry. I'm kind of with you on this one." And suddenly the patient softened and said, You're agreeing with me?" And the psychiatrist said, my student said, "Yes, you're absolutely right. Um, that hurts terribly. I can imagine how sad and hurt you feel, how angry you feel. And you should be feeling that way. You should be pissed off." The patient set the 2 broken chair legs on the floor and sat down in a chair and says, "Well, if that's the way you feel, why don't we talk it over?" And so they talked it over, and he calmed down, and that was that. But there's always truth in what someone is trying to say. And we had a podcast on this, actually. When you think that the criticism is irrational, listen to the music behind the words, and there you'll find the truth in the criticism. And the moment you acknowledge that truth with respect and warmth, the other person will suddenly see, "Hey, I didn't have such a strong case at all, and let's connect in a more respectful or loving way." I don't know if that addresses your question.
It absolutely does, and there's a lot to learn from that story. I really appreciate you telling it. So thank you. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Now, next week, we're going to have a little different format. For the holidays, we all get into our habits and addictions. And oftentimes that's overeating. We start putting on extra pounds. And so next week, we're going to talk about the death of the entitled, pleasure-seeking self, the self that overeats, that has habits, chewing your fingernails, drinking too much, shopaholic, too much cell phone use, too much internet cruising, whatever. And we're going to actually do live therapy and see if we can complete a treatment session with our beautiful and brilliant Rhonda, who says she's been putting on a few extra pounds due to a fantastic and triumphant trip with her husband throughout Europe, spreading the gospel according to Team CBT. And so we'll see what we can do together to reverse that tendency, and to teach all of you how to deal with your own entitled pleasure-seeking self. And if you like next week's 15-minute, hopefully Rhonda cure, then Rhonda and I are going to do a 2-hour free workshop at the end of January on the same topic, and you'll get to learn the technique I'm going to demonstrate next week, and many more to treat your own habit and addiction, whatever it might be.
Okay, everyone, thank you, and please join us again next week from wherever you're tuning in now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.